Well, I appreciate the chance to come back. I know you guys miss not having your pastor here. I certainly can't take his place. I talk with him occasionally. I travel a little bit, as you know he does, so I'm able to. Sometimes on a long trip, I'll give him a call and we'll chat, catch up with what's going on, and share things in our life. And I really value my relationship with Kent. So anyway, again, thank you for allowing me to come and speak today, teach a little bit. I feel pretty good about the direction the Lord has me going this morning. Just listening to you in your conversations inside the fellowship this morning, particularly heard some of the guys over here talking about evangelism. And evangelism is not really one of my favorite topics to talk about because I don't think it's taught real well in church. I think that it's like it's one extreme or the other, and I'm always wrestling with what is my call as far as evangelism and sharing the gospel. How does that really work? Because no one's really ever provided me a teaching which makes sense with what I read. It's like a lot of the quotes about evangelism when I'm encouraged to evangelize and share the gospel, it seems that those quotes aren't in context with what was written. You know, you've heard about the Great Commission, and go ye therefore out into all the world. And I'm like, well, I got a job. I got a family. I mean, what do you mean go ye out in the world? I mean, I don't feel like I'm called to go do this or leave my family like those apostles were. Have you ever had that frustration? I mean, you hear that Great Commission, and I'm not saying that there's not a lot of relevancy in those teachings, but it's a struggle for me. It's always been a struggle. What do you? I mean, I got to be at work at 9 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning, and I got a conference call at 7:30. And so, how do I evangelize? I actually had an interesting conversation with a missionary to the Muslims, a fella that goes all over the world doing this, and his name's Brian, and I've actually got a really interesting book that he wrote, and we support his ministry. But I asked him about this Great Commission, and he says, yeah, in the Greek it says, while you are going. Not go out into the world, it's while you are going. In other words, while you are living life, share the gospel. And even to hear that from an evangelist, someone that's truly an evangelist, to give me that mission, a missionary, to say, now that resonated with me. Okay, while I am going, while I am changing the oil on my boat or something, or while I'm going to Walmart, or while I'm going to work, or while I'm doing whatever, I can share the gospel. Now, I can relate to that, but some of the other stuff, it's just difficult for me. So I've been teaching Romans 1 at our church, and I ran across a phrase that really, Lord, sort of snake bit me, one of those snake bit moments you get when you're reading the Bible, and I want to share that with you a little bit today. I'm actually going to model what we're doing as a sort of a further teaching on the how to study the Bible course. I'm going to go back to some of the terms that we used in that course that we did. I'm just curious, how many of you were here for those 2 nights that I came down and taught? Some of you were here, yeah. That's great. Some of you were here for the How to Study the Bible course that we did. So I'm going to refer to some of those terms. I also want to share this with you regarding that course. I had shared what I had been doing in the document and the work that I'd put into that presentation with my church, and there was some nice response to it, but there really wasn't anyone that said, yeah, we want you to teach that at our church. And it didn't disappoint me. I know it's a little bit different what I do with this, so anyway, but you guys having me come down here and Kent inviting me down to teach with you guys encouraged me to keep working at it. You need a little push. And Kent and you guys certainly provided that. It was so much fun. As it turns out, our pastor went out of town for a week, and they asked me to teach on Wednesday night. So I didn't teach that course because I didn't want to dive into the course, but I actually taught a lesson on why we study the Bible, not how we study the Bible. I taught why we study the Bible as an introduction to the course, okay? And because if you ask the normal, nominal Christian, the everyday guy, why do you study the Bible? What kind of answers do you think you would actually get? I mean, you would get probably the canned, easy fruit. Well, because we're supposed to, or because the pastor told us to. I mean, that's kind of what you would hear from 80 or 90% of the people. And so if you ask yourself that question, why do you study the Bible, what would be your answer? And I took it straight back to the Bible, and then I used that as a model for the teaching, for my teaching plan. So as it turns out, they've now asked me to teach the whole course, and actually going to devote about 5 Sunday nights to me teaching how to study the Bible. And guys, it really, you guys were an impetus for that happening. So I want to thank you for that. So let me pray, and we'll dive into what we have today. Father, I want to thank you for such a sweet worship. It's always so refreshing to come to this fellowship and just sit back and enjoy, and the focus on you that's so evident here. It strikes me every time that I come to Calvary Chapel, Murfreesboro. Father, as we move into your word, I pray that you give me the gift of teaching, that you open our eyes to what you have for us, our ears. I pray be receptive, and most importantly, give us tender and pliable hearts. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so let's turn to Romans chapter 1. Paul's letter to the Roman church, a church that was mostly Gentile in nature. It is my conclusion from reading the book that the church of Rome, the Romans, was led mostly of Jews, but was mostly attended by Gentiles. That's the conclusion that I've got. I've done a lot of reading, other scholarship, and then reading the book. That's what I see. So you have a Jewish-led church with Roman or Gentile attendees written in Rome. As many of you know, Romans is probably the foundational, the most exhaustive book on theology in our Bible. Probably the greatest theological document ever written is the book of Romans. So we're going to pick it up in chapter 1, verse 7. And I'm just going to give you a little precursor, a little context, right, in our teaching. We talked about context, so let's get the context before we get into where we're going to concentrate. Verse 8, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I may mention you always in my prayers, asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you. For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you, that is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles." So, just kind of some context. Paul's writing these Romans, and you can tell by the tone of the letter. Have you ever written or had a phone call or an email with somebody that's sort of expecting you to come, but you haven't come, so you kind of need to give an explanation as to why you hadn't come? That's what he's doing. Those folks want him to come see him. They've heard that he's gone all around the Roman Empire, and he hadn't come to them. And they're probably a touch offended. And they're a little uneasy. I mean, what's wrong with us? Why won't you come see us? And Paul says, look, I want to come see you. I prayed about come seeing you, but I've been hindered. And, he's sort of laying the foundation, saying, look, I care about you. I pray about you. I want to see you. But he's been hindered, and what's hindered him is the Spirit has hindered him to this point coming to Rome. And so he's if they've got their dander up over a little bit by the fact that he hadn't come, he's trying to stem that down. But if you look there at the end, and I'm reading out of the ESV in this app right now, and I know that you guys use the NKJV a lot here, and I'll transition to that shortly. But I noticed there at the last part of 13, if you look at that, it said he has talked about, I want to come see you, I've been hindered, I really want to see you. But then he says he gives his objective. And I'm getting some feedback here. Is that me hitting this? Okay. All right. No, Paul didn't say that. I said, all right. Paul was getting some feedback. All right, so he said, look at the last half of 13b. In order that I may reap some harvest among you as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. So you see what he teed up there? He said, look, I want to see you. I've been hindered from seeing you. The Lord's not allowed me to come see you. But I'm not coming just to make you feel good. He's kind of saying, I'm not coming just because I feel pressure to see you. I'm coming because I want to reap some harvest. There's a mission in why I'm coming. There's always a reason he's going somewhere, and it's to reap a harvest amongst the group he's going to visit. So he transitions subtly, if you notice that, he transitions subtly into where he's going there by having that phrase at the end of this opening. Okay? So let's pick it up with verse 14. Let's see if I can do this. I lost it. You knew I'd do that. How about that? All right. So if you can read this, verses 14 through 15 in your, let me go back one. And there's your NKJV. All right. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to wise and to unwise. So as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome also. So what are we doing right now in our Bible study class? We would be doing observation, right? We would be in the observation phase of our work. So we look at this, and then part of observation, let me give you a little, I mentioned this, it's good to compare with another text. So we grind on that. We say, I'm a debtor, some people, wise and unwise. We see an attitude, as much as it in me. There's an attitude type statement there. I am ready. He's got a verb there. I'm ready to preach the gospel. What is the gospel? To you who are also in Rome. And then we move forward, and we compare that, if you can see that okay, with the ESV. We'll step down. So in the ESV there, you see the same thing, written a little bit different. Notice in, he says, I am under obligation, both to the Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. I am eager to preach the gospel to you. So in the other text, if we compare the ESV and the New King James, remember I talked about making charts as a comparison as we study? So we see here we have 4 components that I identified in my observation. So those of you that weren't there, the first step in analyzing what's going on is observation. You with me? So we're going to observe this, and we're going to compare the two translations side by side. I see that Paul says that he's a debtor. And then in the ESV, it's under obligation. We have an object of the debt or an object of the obligation. We're going to discuss that. And then he says, as much as is in me. And then he says, eager. So we have a statement based on his attitude, his emotional state regarding the text. And then we move over. He's ready to do something, preach the gospel. So as I observe those things, those are some things that I simply picked up. There's plenty more there to look. But those are the things that I picked up that I want to nest on today. So we have a chart there. So where we're going to start is interpretation. So we had observation there. We observed some things. We put them in our chart. Now we want to do some interpretation. Okay? Now this is this was the kind of the snake bit moment for me when I was teaching the other group. Why does Paul define himself as a debtor or under obligation? Paul sees himself as an ower. Why? Now what's a debtor? Most of us are in debt. Most of us are paying off things. Most of us, we owe somebody something, financially speaking. That's the first word that comes to all of our minds. I think our first concept is financial debt. We have a debt that we may have with a friend where we feel like we're in debt to them. If you ever watched Phantom of the Menace, Menace of the Phantom, Star Wars? You guys know Star Wars, right? Phantom of the Menace, right? You know, they got Jar Jar Binks, and Liam Nelson saves Jar Jar Binks, and then they go down and they meet the big guy with the big frog-looking guy, and he says, I understand that he has a debt life for me. You know what I mean? He was in debt. So, I mean, there's debts used in a lot of different ways. And so Paul sees himself in debt or sees himself obligated. Now, here's what's interesting. In his letter to the Romans, the foundational doctrinal letter in all of Christianity, he does not say that he's obligated or in debt to who? Jesus. Isn't that interesting? He does not say that he's in debt to Jesus in his letter to the Romans. And so first off, you have to ask yourself why. And I'm not going to touch on that, but that's something you may want to think about. And in my view is, I'll give you my simple answer to that. I don't think God wants me in debt to him, because I couldn't pay him off anyway. What does God need from me? I mean, do y'all think his debit card's empty? I mean, I don't think he's missing any resources that I have, right? Matter of fact, the resources that I have, he gave to me in the first place. They're all his anyway, right? So I'm not in debt to Jesus. In Paul's letter here, I'm not in debt. I don't owe him anything. But it's interesting that Paul would say that he is in debt. He is in debt to a group of people. And we're going to talk about those in a minute. So he's in debt to a group of people. Now, why would he? What is this sense of debt? I want to talk about this a second. You know, if you were thinking about being saved, do you realize that when you were saved, Paul the debtor, Paul received the gospel by way of divine revelation? That's an interesting point. Every person that's ever been saved is saved by way of a work of the Spirit in your heart. Now, in this verse in Galatians, Paul talks about the gospel came to me. It came from a man, but not according to man. I received the gospel. And remember when we had that conversation in here about received and accept and all that? The term that the Galatians use, and again, is received. He received the gospel by way of divine revelation. So something that was ingrained inside Paul. When I looked at Paul the debtor, I wanted to understand maybe what his perspective about how he came into this relationship with Jesus. So he received the gospel by way of divine revelation. Paul also understands what it says in Hebrews, that Jesus suffered for all classes of man. Jesus suffered for every group. And if you were a Jew, Paul was a Jew, that would be really important. And when you look at Paul's missionary bent, his message to the Gentiles, the Jews thought what? They were the only ones that had access to God. And then with the revelation of Jesus and the coming of Jesus Christ and the cross, everything changed, and Jesus became open to everyone. Access to God was no longer an Israelite type channel. Okay, it was strictly open to everyone, and Paul recognizes that that Jesus came and suffered for all man. And then it also says in Acts chapter 9, it's interesting, Paul would look at himself this way. He knows from Acts chapter 9 that he is a chosen vessel. And I think that's important, that he was specified out by God as a vessel to go to the Gentiles. So he received from God divine revelation about Jesus Christ. That's a dogmatic fact. It's in Galatians. Jesus Christ suffered for all man, all classes of men, all races, all demographics, all political class, all economic, all class of man. We understand that now. And then finally, that Paul understood he was a chosen vessel. Now let's look at the people, the object of the debt. In other words, your object of your debt, if you borrowed money on a house, you have to pay off the bank, right? And that is what I'm identifying as our object of debt. Okay? It's interesting, like I said, that Paul does not define Jesus or God as his object of debt. He identifies everybody. Paul says, I owe everybody, which makes sense with what I put there in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, that Jesus suffered for all man. All classes, all groups of man, Jesus suffered for. He didn't exclude anybody. Now look at this. This is kind of interesting. I just did a little quick study. I don't know where they come up with these numbers. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if there's 300 million people in the world. It says here the world population at the time of Paul was 300 million. I looked at a couple of websites. Again, I don't know how they came up with this information, but for kicks and giggles and the purpose of this discussion, let's just say that's the way it is. Okay? Accept that? All right. 300 million people. Paul says that he is in debt to Greeks and barbarians. Greeks and barbarians. Now, the Greeks would be more of the cultured people, right? The barbarians would be everybody else. For me, the Greeks would be Tennessee fans, barbarians, Alabama, all right? But that's kind of how we look at it, all right? All right, so there you go, and there are 40, and at that time, if I did a little work, I said, okay, I'm going to figure there were 45 million. That was the population of the Romans in. And then the rest of the world was the remaining 255 million. So I said, okay, if I'm a Roman, I'm going to think we're all cultured. Okay, fine. Y'all are the Greeks. And here's the thing. The Roman culture came kind of out of the Greek culture. Won't get into all that. But Paul says, bottom line is, I'm in debt to 300 million people. He's in debt to 300 million people. That's a lot of debt, okay? You know what else he says? He's in debt to the wise and the unwise. Now, here's the math that I use here. There's the 300 million again, right? Okay? And I figured 10% are wise, right? That's probably if you look at Facebook, that's probably a little regressive, right? But that's 10%. 10% is 30 million. Now, the rest of us, and look, there's nothing wrong being in that 270 million people of unsmart people. Because what does it say in 1 Corinthians? Not many wise come to know the Lord in the first place. So I think I'll just stay over here in the red anyway, all right? That's the 270 million. So here it is. Paul's given us four basic groups of people: Greeks, barbarians, wise and unwise, and this is the way I've divided it up for us to talk about. That's a lot of people to be in debt to, but that's what he was saying. Now, let's look at his attitude. Paul was eager. Can y'all see okay back over here? Paul was eager. It says in the New King James, it says, as much as is in me. And then we have the word eager. So I looked it up in the Greek dictionary. I clicked on as much as is in me, and then I went to ESV and clicked on eager. Greek dictionary. It says he was forward in spirit and predisposed. Okay, forward in spirit means in the way I looked at it, he's got a strong inclination to resolve that debt. You understand what I'm saying? If you got a late notice on a car payment, or you got a late notice on something you really want to keep, you would have a strong inclination. You would be forward in spirit to make sure you wrote off that debt, right? Well, I need to get caught back up. Here's my little late penalty. You know, here we go. I'm going to get back on track here because I'm forward in spirit. I'm predisposed because I don't want somebody showing up and taking my car off, right? Well, that's that's a simple way of putting. That's his situation here. He's forward in spirit. He's predisposed. I actually, you guys know me. I look on a secular source. Go to dictionary.com. What's eager mean? I love doing this because I get so much insight. It's keen or ardent in desire, impatiently longing. Paul is impatiently longing to respond to the debt issue he has with 300 million people. That's what he's saying right there. And again, when we look at interpretation, this is the secret to interpretation. Why I like doing it like this, is my preferred way, is because let's take the emotion out of it. I was talking to one of you this morning, they said the word dogmatic. You know, and one of the things that you guys may recall from the teaching class I said was, God's not a God of confusion. God didn't write the Bible to trick us. Seriously. And I said that to a fellow. I may have shared this with you guys at one of those nights. I shared this with a fellow that I work with. We were at lunch, and I said, he was talking about, I don't understand how to read the Bible and really want to get into it. But I said, well, look, here's the deal. God didn't write the Bible to trick us. In other words, there's not multiple interpretations. That's something Peter said. There are not multiple interpretations to something. There's nothing new. When God wrote what he wrote it, and it meant what it meant. He said what he said, and that's the way it is. Now, the problem with that is all the different classes within the church and all the churches within the church have gone up and created all these different interpretations. But I promise you, no one has given me pause to think there are multiple interpretations to what it says. It's one way or the other. Because I just don't think God wrote it to confuse us, which means somebody's wrong. Right? It means it's okay to be wrong, okay? But it's okay to just figure it out. If I sit here with Mike and we have two conclusions on a topic, one of us is not right, and maybe but between me and Mike, probably both of us are wrong. And we need to go figure it out. But you know what? We, as brothers, we sit down and we look at these conclusions constructively, and we see, okay, why did you come up with this conclusion? I came up with this reason. What about you? I came up with this reason. Now let's figure out, does it make sense? But we're just afraid to do that. I mean, we're afraid to have these discussions in church anymore. And so it's unfortunate. But anyway, that's my perspective on this. So anyway, Paul was an eager guy. Now what is he eager to do? Preach the gospel. Right? He's eager to preach. He's in debt. To resolve the debt, he wants to preach the gospel. And he wants to do it with an attitude of eagerness. Now, if you ask most people in church today, what's the gospel? What are they going to say? The good news. All right, okay, it's good news. All right, I got a raise. That's good news, right? I mean, there's a lot of good news. And it's a good news. I mean, people struggle with that. I don't think that's a problem with this group. You've been taught, but I'm going to tell you something. It's a problem in a lot of places. If you ask them, what's the gospel? They say, what's the good news? And I guess that's true. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that answer, but it's really not the depth of the good news. What is the news then? You got to keep digging down. Well, let me tell you what preaching the gospel means. Declare the good news. The word preach, if you look it up in a concordance, you're going to see the word declare. Okay, so we want to declare the good news. What is this news? What is this gospel? It's defined pretty simply in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And if you just want to, it's just that simple. It's that simple. Just read the first 10 or 12 verses of 1 Corinthians 15, and it's summed up in the first 2 or 3 of those 15. You know what? He died. He was buried. Jesus rose. Jesus was seen, all according to the Scriptures. And he did this so we can be saved from our sin. The debt payment was made. And it's all according to the Scriptures. And look, remember this. Guys, you would be shocked how many people inside a church, attending a church today, with shadows darkening the door, don't know those 4 things. He died, he was buried, he rose, and he was seen, all according to the Scriptures. So Paul has a debt to 300 million people. He wants to eagerly resolve that debt by doing what? Preaching the gospel. He feels a sense of obligation to this activity. So how do we apply this? So this is always my struggle. This just gets me back to where I started. This Great Commission. I got it. Nothing wrong with it. It's great stuff. Matthew 28, Great Commission. But how do I execute that? What does that mean to me? As a day in, day out believer, I got a job, I got a wife, I got a kid, I got all these things going on. How do I do this? Do I feel a sense of obligation to share the gospel? I do. I think that's healthy, right? I think we should have a sense of obligation to share the gospel. And you know what? And we should share it in the manner that Paul has prescribed, in an eager fashion, right? We got to be willing to do that, okay? So application. So here's what we've done, just to kind of rehearse from the Bible study course. We had observation. We did our observation, right? We came up with 4 components we were going to look at. Then we did interpretation. We looked at those 2 verses, hopefully in context, and we made an unemotional assessment of what it said. We have to be willing to do that. And most folks are not willing to make, and I stress, an unemotional assessment of what it says. A thorough assessment of what it says in that fashion. And now we move forward to application. Application. Okay, now it's where it can get a little bit of some emotion, because you should feel something in this application, because this is about your life right here. How does it work? What application is. How does it work for me? How does it work for others? Determine the practical use or relevance. So we just looked at 2 verses for moments, and I want to find the practical use of what it says. Okay? Frank the debtor. So just put your name in it. What if you put your name in that place? Let's see how it works. Frank received the gospel by way of divine revelation. You know what I did? I found a verse that says that right there. 1 Thessalonians 1, 4, and 5. It says, you know how Paul said he received the gospel by way of divine revelation? You know what Paul told the Thessalonians? So did they. So why would I be different than Paul in my attitude? If we came to be saved the same way. I come from the same production system, the same assembly line, the work of the Spirit within me, divine revelation. You know what? Jesus suffered for all classes of man. He suffered for Paul, the Jew. He suffered for me, the overweight Tennessean. You know what I'm saying? That's what he did. Okay? And then finally, I mean, you know what Paul said, that he was a chosen vessel in Acts chapter 9? He recognized from the book of Acts, he didn't say it, he was identified in Acts chapter 9 as a chosen vessel. Do you understand that I put this in because it's from John, and you guys have been studying John, right? If you go to John chapter 1, it said, John chapter 1, verse 12, it says that you're privileged. Or it says that you have the right to be called the children of God, exactly in your New King James. You have the right. And if you look up that word right, it means privileged. You are privileged. Just as Paul was a chosen vessel, I am a privileged, I'm going to say vessel, to be called the children of God. So Paul and I are in the same place. There's no difference between how salvation came to me and how salvation came to Paul. But what's interesting, he had such a deep sense of obligation to 300 million people. A deep sense of obligation. And I go sometimes, maybe I don't feel as obligated as he does. Okay? So let's address that. Finally, I want to say this about application. Something is missing. And this is where I really want to encourage you today as I move towards my close. Something is missing now. You know what I didn't do? And when I put this together, I actually went through this. And I got here at the end. I said, well, I didn't do something else. What have I not done yet? I haven't read the verses after what we're studying. Remember I talked about context? Right? So we had to read the verses in front of 14 and 15. Now I need to read the verses behind 14 and 15. You know what? And here's the secret. This really hit me home with the obligation. It really hit me home like, man, look what I have access to. Look at the verses right after verses 14 and 15. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. And look at that. I want you to read what I wrote here. The greatest force known to mankind, the power to turn death to life. The greatest, here's my point on this, and I don't have time to teach through this. This is one of my favorite subjects. This is my opinion. So let me make sure that y'all understand. This is my opinion. Right now, I currently believe that God takes the most glory. And watch this statement. God worships himself. Because I believe he does things to encourage worship in him. God is bound by his own character for him to receive worship. You understand what I'm saying? That's kind of a heavy way to think. But it's deep thinking. Because if I came in here today and say, y'all need to worship me, you say, that's crazy. We're not worshiping you. But God can stand up and say, I am to be worshiped. Okay? So God knows that he is to be worshiped, but I think the means by which I think his favorite means for that worship to come is when we recognize he is the only power in the universe that can change death to life. You, as a believer, have access to this power. See, you have the insight, you have the skill set, and most importantly, you have access to this power. Now, that doesn't mean that you can turn a switch and someone's going to be saved. That's not what that means. That does not mean that you have any control over it, because if you read John chapter 3 says what? The Spirit goes where it will, like the wind. Who can control the wind? But still, we have the insight, we have the skill set, we have the access, no different from Paul. Through us, not according to us, like Paul said in Galatians, for God to work and someone be saved. And guys, I don't care how much power the guy over in Korea has with his missiles. I don't care what Putin's got. I surely couldn't care less what Trump or the rest of them got. They don't have the power to turn death to life. They don't have the power. My favorite example is they don't have the power to take Sarah's womb, which was dead at 80 years old, and create life. You follow me? Sarah's womb was dead. It was barren. It had no life. Just like the spiritual life of an unsaved person. Yet God, through His supernatural power, gives us an example of that power through Sarah's womb, and life came to that dead womb. And a child named Isaac. Is that right? Yeah, Isaac was born. Yeah, I didn't want to jump to Jacob or something, right? So, all right. So, something dead came out of something alive. And I'm going to tell you something. The same thing happens to us. We have a dead heart. We have a dead spirit. We are dead. And God supernaturally takes something dead and creates life. Why do you think in John all of these miracles have to do with creation? What was the first miracle He did? He changed what? Water into wine. God's sovereignty over His creative powers takes something and changes it to something else. Jesus takes the lunchbox of those boys and that boy, and He turns it and feeds all these people. All that creative power. The greatest way that God shows His power to me is the ability for Him to take dead man and create a live man. The power of God to save is right there. And guys, Paul felt an obligation to share the knowledge of that power with other people. So here's the close. Do you feel under obligation? If you really sit back and look at what Paul said and look at Paul's journey, Paul's debt to 300 million people. Do you ever view yourself as in debt to the people you work with? Do you ever see you feel in debt with friends, with relatives? There's a debt there. And look, you get into a deep sense here. I mean, you got the old thing, you know, when Jesus sent out the disciples and they didn't receive Him, what did He tell them to do? Kick the dust off your feet. And let me tell you something. If the Spirit's not moving in someone's heart, no matter how good a persuader you are, how good a communicator you are, if the Spirit's not working on someone's heart, nothing's going to happen. Paul understood that as good as anybody. But that didn't prevent him from sharing the gospel with other people. So how do we do this? You know, guys, I guess you pray about it. Number one, obviously. And I think I think the phrase that always jumps in my mind about this obligation is be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. You know, whenever I'll give you one example, and this is where I'll stop. I do feel a sense of obligation. When I was sitting here in worship, and you guys do such a good job with that. I'm telling you, you don't know how good you got it. I'm just telling you. You know, you just don't know how good you got it. You know, just the spirit that's in here when you guys are worshiping. But I just take it from somebody coming from the outside. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with how we worship at our church. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying you guys got nice. But there's, you know, it's the simple things, and I'll say this all humility. I mean, this is just an example, but it's the little things that can make a difference. Recently, we had a problem at work, and I called my boss on a Friday afternoon, and I said, look, we've got a problem here. And, you know, we're about to get in a lot of trouble with a customer. And he said, it's like 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. He says, don't ruin everybody's ruin everybody's weekend with an email on this now. Just do it Monday morning. I knew that wasn't the right decision, but he was my boss, and so I did it. Right? Knowing I'm probably going to take a hit for this because his boss is not going to be happy. The big boss. So in essence, I get back in Monday morning and sent out the email letting him know, and sure enough, I got the email from the boss's boss. He said, when did you find out about it? No, we got into a conference call. When did you find out? I found out about it Friday afternoon. Well, why didn't you let everybody know? Now, what do you do there? What do most people do? I didn't do that. I took the hit. And I knew Friday afternoon I was going to take the hit. Guys, let me tell you something. And so here's what was interesting about that situation. 6 months later, I was up in Detroit, and my boss said, just out of nowhere, He says, you know, I want you to know something. I remember that time you took the hit for me. Now look, he didn't get saved right then. All I know is he felt something different. I took a hit. And maybe one day it'll offer me taking enough hits for whoever. It'll give me a chance to share why I take the hit. Because hopefully I took that hit because it's not about me. It's about who I am. And look, there have been plenty of times that I've failed in this exercise. Okay, don't get me wrong. I don't do it right all the time. I don't like taking a hit any more than you do. All right? But I do want to brag about the one time I did it right, right? But guys, here's the thing. Here's the thing. I mean, guys, that's how we got to live. Maybe that's the way where it says, while you are going, maybe that's what that means there in the Great Commission. So, anyway, I have a sense of obligation. My question to you is, do you feel the sense of obligation? And if the answer is yes, think about how you're going to resolve that debt. Okay? Because there's 300 million people out there that need Jesus. Okay? Father, I thank you for a chance to speak today. I thank you for the receptive hearts and minds of these folks. It's such a pleasure to get to come down here. I want to lift up Ken as he travels and pray for fruit, a harvest on his journey. Lord, I pray that we take to heart Paul's message here, that you speak to us regarding its execution, and that we trust that you will do that we just take care of the business that we can take care of with an eye out with an opportunity to share Jesus. And Lord, I pray that we recognize the power that you possess and just how infinitely mind-blowing it is that you can take death and create life. Father, we're going over to see a little baby be born here in a few minutes. And how magnificent it is that in the way you created the world, you created physical birth as a model for spiritual birth that only you create. So, Father, I pray people see Jesus in us, and you get all the glory. We pray in his name. Amen. Thank y'all.